So the point is that I was just coming to there before the camera cut out, is that who it is who is hoping to make helpful changes to my mental health isn't who I really am, because who I really am, something I can't know, at least I can't know it with the thinking mind, which is my only tool. Instead, who I think I am is a mental construct. It's the idea of who I am, the belief of who I am, the hypothesis or theory of who I am that I have long since stopped questioning or looking at, and now I'm taking it for granted totally. So this is the big trick that happens in life. We take the one thing for granted that we never should do and rush on ahead on this basis. We charge ahead, rush on ahead, living life on the basis of who we automatically assumed ourselves to be, making plans on the basis of who we assumed we were without even realizing that we have assumed anything. So everything is on this very precarious basis, and if this basis just happened to be untrue, if it happened to be false, this immediately means that everything we think, everything we plan, everything we hope, everything we fear, everything we put together, everything we achieve, good word, achieve, who achieves it? This ghost in the head. So what it means is that all of that stuff is what? It's the fantasies of someone who I think I am, but I'm not. And whether I am successful in realizing to some extent these fantasies or not makes not the slightest bit of difference to the question as to how fantastical they are. Because my dreams of success are just as fantastical as my dreams of failure, because they only apply to this kind of hypothesis or idea I have of myself, which isn't true. Obviously, it can't be true because the mind, as we have said, can't come up with a literally true picture of reality. It can only come up with its own theories and its own hypotheses, which appear to be true as long as we narrow our field of attention so that we never ever look at those regions that would immediately tend to discount or disprove our hypothesis. So that's how we get the hypothesis to be true, by disregarding all the messages that come back saying it isn't true and narrowing our world so it only encompasses that very small, limited domain in which it could be said my hypothesis works or it seems to work. Ultimately, it doesn't, but in the short term, if I make my world simplistic enough, my ideas seem to be viable matches for reality. My idea of myself seems to be true, in other words, and I can get a certain amount of leeway. I can charge ahead, making plans, hoping for stars, struggling to achieve, etc. It's just that, and it's not that I don't put loads of energy. Well, personally, I don't know how much energy I put in it. We don't put. It's not that we don't put much energy into it. We put loads of energy into it, and that's the folly of it, or the comedy of it, if we want to look at it that way, or the tragedy of it. It's kind of, I suppose we could say it's all three at once. It's folly, it's tragedy, and it's comedy. So how do you fix that? Our attempts to obtain mental health for ourselves, to secure it, are also comedy, uh, tragedy comedy, and complete and utter foolishness. So there's this big mass of foolishness, and it all seems to make sense from the point of view of the rational ego, the very, very narrow and totally untrue idea of who we are. It all seems to make sense. Outside, if we even step that far from that viewpoint, the viewpoint which is the viewpoint of the rational ego. So if we even step half a millimeter away, all of that nonsense becomes visible as what it is, utter fluffy nonsense. It's it's not real. It's just, and as soon as we step to one side, despite the fact that it seems crushingly real when we're struggling in the game to succeed and not fail, we suddenly realise that it's just like marshmallows. It's just like fluffy clouds. It's just like it's nothing. It is fantasy, total fantasy, and yet we take all this fantasy seriously, and we call this business where we take fantasy seriously. We call it our lives, but it's not. It's what in the Eastern traditions they call samsara. We're wandering in samsara. We're not wandering in samsara because we have been bewitched, though in a way we have. But our normal way of understanding it might be to say we're wandering in samsara because we're not seeing the world as it truly is. But we could also say, and it kind of makes the point better to say that we're wandering in samsara, or illusion, virtual reality, hyper reality, whatever we want to say, because our central concept of us actually has nothing to do with our actual essential nature. So we're living in a world that belongs to the self-concept, that is a reflection of the self-concept. And our notions of health, we automatically assume they must apply to that self-concept, that self-hypothesis. So the big problem here is that me automatically assuming that this idea of myself is absolutely who I am. End of story. That's who I am. That is the fundamental lack of mental health, we could say. Um, Wei Wu Wei says, "What's our fundamental problem?" And then answers it, saying, "Mistaken identity." Sounds so simple. You know, if you were a professor of psychology or whatever, you'd probably write all sorts of complicated stuff. And do you know, there's no way we just say, "Oh, the root of it all is in mistaken identity." We wouldn't be able to get a PhD by using that as our basic assumption, our basic hypothesis to be tested. It doesn't sound very scientific and impressive. But the whole edifice of our psychological understanding isn't really psychological understanding, it's pseudo-psychological understanding as it appears to the false or conceptual identity. And the basis of it, is the conceptual identity, which we absolutely never question because that's our solid point, our sound point. We only get the world to be real for us by never questioning our assumed identity. And so everything that comes out of us is an extrapolation, extension, projection of our totally mistaken assumed identity. And the ultimate point of it all is to somehow make that mistaken identity more solid, more real, and to make it so it doesn't have to have any problems, which it does always have problems because of the incoherence of what it does and what it wants to do and what actually reality is. So it's always suffering from incoherence. A model that doesn't fit reality, that causes things not to work as we think they should do. So it always causes incoherence, and we could call that neuroticism, neurotic behavior, neurotic suffering, neurotic entrapment. And yet, despite this, we have this fundamental unexamined idea that the conceptual identity, the false self, can control things in line with how it understands itself and the universe. It can make itself healthy, or it can progress in the direction of better mental health by firmly grasping hold of its assumptions that it never questions and never will. So we're trying to steamroller everything to be the right way on a false basis, and we're refusing to even consider the possibility that the basis is false. So starting off from the mistaken identity of thinking that we are who we aren't, and taking it very, very, very seriously indeed, and getting very, very stressed out about it, we could say that mental health, our search for mental health, is really just a search for the way to live as this illusory entity without ever having to know that it's illusory, without ever having to suffer the, um, the lashback of incoherence.